Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and my guest today is Nechama Birnbaum. Now, she's the author of the Redhead of Auschwitz book that is available on Amazon. I don't get any money for saying this,
Mhm.
but it is her grandmother's story, and that's why I've asked her to come on the podcast and tell us the history behind the book. So, Nechama, let's start with before the war.
First of all, thank you so much for having me on. Thank you for all the amazing, important work that you do. I appreciate it. So my grandmother grew up in Krasna, Romania, and it was always she described it as always being like thrown from Hungary to Romania, Romania to Hungary, and they were always fighting for it. So sometimes she was considered Romanian, sometimes she was considered Hungarian, but in her heart, she thought of herself as Romanian. She loved her town. It was this little village, really, like a mountain village. She described.
In the
Swi
Parthians?
I don't think so. I think it was. I'm not exactly sure. It was near Satu Mare.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah. So she always described like a really idyllic childhood, swimming in the lake and ice skating on it in the winter. She was very happy. Her mother was best friends with someone, um, Emma. I don't know if I knew her last name, a, a non-Jew. They were best friends. Um, it was very much a community, so that everybody took care of each other. Her father died when she was 5 years old, and her grandfather stepped into that role. Her grandfather loved her so much. She was always talking about her grandfather, which I actually have a son that I named after him. And she he died when she was 11, and she also had a little brother that died before the war. He was 5 when he died. But even with all the tragedies that happened to her, she always describes her childhood as something beautiful. And she loved to dance. She used to dance at school and the plays. And she said that people threw flowers at her feet when she was done. And she recited the poetry in front of the whole school for their festivals. Um, then, when she was around 12, she had to go to work, because at that point, the Hungarians were coming in already, and they shut down there was a yeshiva there
Okay,
where
so
her
wait,
mother worked.
we need to know what year. So I always say this for people who don't know. Nazi Germany invaded Poland, the western part of Poland, on September 1st, 1939. A few days later, under the secret agreement, the Russian Soviet Union invaded the eastern part of Poland. Okay, so now, and then in June 1941, the Nazis broke the non-aggression pact with the Russians, and they took it the rest of Poland, blah, blah, blah. But Hungary was an ally, as was Romania of Nazi Germany. So now what year are we talking about?
In 1940, I believe Hungary took over Romania, and nothing much changed for the Jews then. Like, they weren't transported or anything, they weren't in ghettos, but they did shut down the yeshiva in that was in Krasna, and her mother was the breadwinner of the family, worked as the cook in the
Oh,
yeshiva. So her mother lost her job. And at that point, she had 3 children. She couldn't afford to feed them. So she sent them out to her siblings, and they would help. She like babysat her cousins and, for room and board, um, which she hated so much. And she begged to come home. So her mother brought her back home. Actually, her mother wrote a letter to her sister that you can keep her for another few months because I really can't feed her at home. And she found the letter before her aunt did. And she ripped up the letter and flushed it down the toilet because she was like, I'm not staying here. And so she went home and they became seamstresses, and they were able to make a living that way. And then in 1944, they were taken already to the ghetto.
okay. So now we need to say what happened in March. So was it before March 1944? So
It was, I could give you the, I can get the book and give you the exact
yeah,
dates.
you get the exact date while I explain to the audience. And yes, go ahead and hold up the book. So the Hungarians at this point were thinking about, yes, so the redhead, okay. They were
You
thinking
should have
about,
seen my grandmother hold this up. She was so proud of it.
I can
She,
imagine.
yeah.
The Hungarians were kind of talking, maybe they would have a, maybe they wanted to get out of the war, fighting on the Nazis' part. And the Nazis weren't so happy. So they marched into Budapest in March of 1944. Now, was your grandmother rounded up before then or right after then
May 10th,
of
1944.
1944?
Yeah,
Okay,
May 10th.
so we know that the rural Jews were rounded up first in Hungary. The Jews in Budapest got a little bit of reprieve. So then what happened to your mother?
So she was brought to, it was called the
Grandmother. I
Klein.
keep saying, sorry, grandmother.
She also felt like a mother to me. She was brought to the Klein Brickyard, it was called, um, which she said was almost worse than Auschwitz. It was a terrible, terrible experience there. First of all, they rounded everybody up, made them strip naked just for a humiliation, and then brought them to this brickyard where they had no shelter whatsoever and no food. So it was only whatever food they brought with them, and they took um, branches from trees and their clothing and made tents. That's how they had to sleep. There's actually pictures of this brickyard. There you see some of these handmade tents. But every time they put up their tent, the Hungarian police who they were walking around there kept knocking it down and putting it in the mud and saying, you can't sleep here, you're not allowed, until it took them hours until they were able to set up some kind of shelter for themselves. And then it was a brickyard, so they worked in that brickyard, really schlepping bricks back and forth. And that was for 3 weeks. Whatever they only were able to eat, whatever they brought with them. So by the time then 3 weeks later, they were sent on the cattle cars to Auschwitz. And by the time she describes her mother looking like an old woman, her mother was, I believe, 38 years old. And she describes her mother looking like an old woman. She was already emaciated. They didn't have any food. So she was sent straight to the gas chambers, when her mother was when they got there. And her sister were sent to work.
Wait, no, no, wait,
Actually,
no, wait. We haven't mentioned her sister. Is her sister younger?
yeah, so she had a brother and sister with her in the ghetto. She was the oldest, and she had a younger brother who was named after her father because he was born after her father had already passed away. And then she had a younger sister. First, her younger sister was like 17 months younger than her. The smarter, more beautiful sister, she describes it. And it was her sister, and then her brother was 13 years old. But her brother was her mother's baby because he was always the baby, and also he was the one that was born after she had just lost her husband. So when they sent him to the right with his sisters, and the mother was sent to the left, she didn't know where she was going. So she said, Yechazkel, come here, Yechazkel, stay with me. And he went with her mother straight to the gas chambers. So that image, I think, was always like seared into my grandmother's memory of her brother running to be back with his mother and then to his death.
Yes, I've heard other stories
Yeah,
that's the heartbreaking stories at that point at which people have done or not done. And okay, let's move past that. Now,
yeah.
so her sister was with her. Then what happened?
She was with her sister the whole time. Actually, the first thing she describes in Auschwitz was they took away her clothing, whatever she had, and they gave her a uniform. They shaved her head, which was particularly, I mean, I chose to name this book The Redhead of Auschwitz because her red hair was so meaningful to her. Because when she was in this Transylvanian superstitious village that she grew up, it was considered a curse, red hair. And the woman in the market used to spit at her, and they would tell her, it's getting the devil out of your hair. And they also used to tell her it was ugly. And her mother wanted her to, she was the only redhead in the family. Her mother wanted to, took like nut oils or something and tried to dye her hair. And she said she described it to me so vividly. She would be sitting in their garden and she had to keep her eyes closed the whole time because she had these oils coming down on her face, dripping down, and her mother would be massaging her scalp with oils to try to dye it. And the whole time she said she would be praying, please don't let it work. Please don't let it work. Please don't let it work. And then she would go look in the mirror, and of course, not oils wasn't dyeing anybody's hair. So, and she would be like, oh, phew, it's still red. And then she described it to me. She would look at herself in the mirror and say, you are so beautiful. Don't listen to what anyone tells you. You are so beautiful. And so when they shaved her hair, it was kind of like such an important part of her identity that she felt like she was having totally snatched away from her. Um, but for me, it was such a symbol. Her red hair was such a symbol of her determination of really not listening to anyone else and being confident in who she was because um, the next day in Auschwitz, they were working. She was already with all her, they were still with her childhood friends. And the Nazis told them, look up. You see that cloud of smoke? That's your mothers, your fathers, your sisters, your brothers, everyone you know and love, your children. That's all that remains of them, and that's all that's going to remain of you. And she described it to me, my grandmother, how she looked at her friends, and her friends said, we're going to heaven from here. That was how they consoled themselves. They said, we know we're going to die, but we're going straight to heaven from here. And she turned to them and said, you can go to heaven from here. I'm going home from here. And they looked at her like she always made the face that they made at her, like, oh, this poor delusional girl. Like, oh my goodness, she's really losing her sense of reality. And she said, no, don't tell me where I'm going. I'm going home from here. And she said she was the only one of her friends that did. She went home and for me, that was part of it was that redhead, stubborn spirit in her that wouldn't listen to anyone and wouldn't give up. And I'll actually never forget, I went to visit Auschwitz when I was 18 years old, the same age that she was when she was in Auschwitz. And I was like, oh, she was right. She went home because like, look, I'm here. And it
Yeah,
was
that must
it
have
was
been
meaningful.
incredibly
Yeah.
meaningful.
Yeah.
Did her sister survive?
Her sister survived with her the whole time. She describes they had an amazing relationship. She described her sister was less determined to survive than she was. And she said, "You see, everybody has different talents. She was the beautiful, smart one, but I was the survivor one in the family." So she encouraged her sister to survive the whole time, because her sister wanted to give up. And then at the end, when she was on the death march, she was ready to give up. At that point, she couldn't take another step. That this was a year into, you know,
Right. So now we're in January 1945. So
yeah.
she didn't go to another camp.
She
She
did.
left in a death march from Auschwitz, right?
So the death march was actually from Judelstadt. It was an ammunition factory to Theresienstadt. But
Okay,
her sister didn't let her give up then. So it was kind of came full circle.
that's very interesting.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
for people who don't know, um, Hama said Theresienstadt, but I say Terezín. It's in Czech. It's in the Czech Republic, Czechia. It's north of Prague. So it's farther west, closer to Germany. So that's why when they started emptying Auschwitz, they started marching them towards various places, including Terezín. And so, do you want to describe the Death March a little, for people to really understand how many days, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, it was 3 weeks. At first, they were on a train, and the train was bombed by the Allies. So then they made them walk. They didn't have any food or anything. I don't like that was the hardest part of everything for my grandmother. And whoever stopped was just either shot or just beaten to death. And that was it. And my grandmother, she loved telling this story. She said she was okay. I cannot take another step. She said it felt like I was gonna have to lift the whole world on my knee. I couldn't do it. So she told her sister, I'm sitting down. And her sister was like, "Oh, no, you don't. You made me survive this whole thing. You're not gonna give up now." And she actually said that she said, "Well, I can't do it. I'm not going to be able to take another step." And her sister said, "Well, you have to. I don't care. You have to." And she said she took that step, and she was the hardest thing she ever did. And then she felt something come to her right, like almost like an angel. She describes it as, and then like an angel come to her left, and she felt like she glided the rest of the way there.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And so then what happened?
Then she was in Terezin. They were, though she was just there for 10 days. This was also a beautiful story that she had there. They were in a bunker. And she said already at that point, they were so malnourished that she was in and out of consciousness. Nobody bothered with them. She doesn't remember anyone. It was just, she heard the fighting between the Russians and the Germans the whole time. Um, but she was in and out and so sick, really just starved. And she felt like she was just buried alive, like she was just laying there. She couldn't move. Um, And then one day, somebody opened up the bunker and said, "Girls, don't you know you're free?" And she said they started laughing because they didn't know what to do with them with that emotion. They didn't, what does free mean? What does that mean? And she said she climbed out of that bunker and it felt like she was climbing out of her grave. And she was, "I'm alive. I'm alive." It's a very funny feeling. She described it. It's a funny feeling to be alive. And then she saw there was wildflowers growing all over. This was, I'll get you the exact date. I think it was also May.
So for those of you who
Um,
don't know, Terezin actually was a camp that was set up in a military, former military camp. So I've been there. So you see, it's like ramparts around the outer thing. And on top of the ramparts, imagine like grass fields. So I
mm,
have a feeling that these are where the wildflowers that she saw.
yeah, she describes it. I thought it was May 8th, I believe.
Right. And
And
which
so it
is
was
Victory in
spring.
Europe Day. Okay.
Yes. So she described she all she saw was wildflowers, wildflowers, wildflowers. And she said she felt like she was being reborn again. And she felt like God was telling her, there's still going to be beauty in your life. There's going to be you're going to be okay. Like you're going to still have beauty. And actually, 77 years from that date that she climbed out of that, what she called her grave, she was actually buried. She recently passed away in May, and she was buried, I believe, May 8th. So,
That's
yeah,
really interesting.
yeah.
Now tell us about afterwards when they were liberated. Then what happened?
They were in treason spot, which actually, because it was a propaganda camp, had an old age home because they wanted to show the world, look, we're there was a
Exactly.
few old people left there. So she described it as always in her time in Auschwitz and her time in Dusha, she always tried to not do as little work as possible. She was so tiny and she knew that she need to save all of her energy. But she said, so I knew in the camps doing work was going to kill me, but I knew afterwards not working was going to kill me even more. She had to keep busy and so she immediately, they needed volunteers in the old age home. She volunteered. She went there and she started working for them. They loved her there and someone gave her a suitcase of old dresses that someone had left, so, someone who was probably killed. And she dressed up all of the girls that were with her in these beautiful dresses. She belted them. She said she worked in fashion her whole life afterwards. Like she was a stylist. She was very proud of how she chose the right outfits for people. So she that's what she did. She dressed up people, and then it was only for a few weeks or even less. And then they were all trying to go home. And so she took a train back home. Um, and she thought she thought she would find her mother and her brother. She didn't really believe.
She
that
didn't
they were,
believe?
no, she didn't believe that they were killed. She thought they made it also. And that was really, really, terrible for her when she realized they're not coming back.
Yes, it must have been extremely extreme because of the chance that her
Yeah,
brother could have maybe survived, although,
right.
maybe he wouldn't.
Right.
It's,
That did give her comfort to know that he probably wouldn't have survived and he didn't have to suffer. So,
yes, exactly.
mm,
I once read a short story that I've never forgotten about someone making a decision as a young, beautiful woman was getting off at the ramps at Auschwitz. Should he try and save her, or should he just tell her because she to stand near the corners in the gas chambers because it would be a quicker death? And I've always thought of that in
mm,
terms of
yeah,
making that decision.
yeah.
So, so what else would you like to share? What compelled you to decide to write this true story?
My grandmother was always very passionate about telling her story. And, it's interesting. Her dream came true when she was 95 years old. So it's never too late. She always wanted to tell it. I love writing. It's a real passion of mine. Um, and to me, a lot of books, I don't know if this was just my experience or if this is true. A lot of the books I read about the Holocaust when I was younger were about a non-Jew saving a Jewish person,
Right.
whether hiding them, Number the Stars we read in school,
Yes,
which is
Lois
all
Lowry.
great. Yeah, beautiful, great, and important stories. But I was like, I know a Jew who saved herself. And I wanted to write about her determination and her grit and her experience in the actual camps, um, and her bravery. And also, I just loved her so much. And I wanted to, honor her wish of having her story told.
So it's really wonderful that she lived to old enough to really appreciate what you had done for her and to
Yeah.
appreciate that her story is being told.
Yeah. I felt bad. Like I felt guilty that she had to relive the memories
Yes,
a lot and
that's
telling.
right. That's always
Yeah. Yeah. But she was signing it, and even at the very end of her life when she was in the hospital, she was out. This one signed. She was signing it for all love Rosie. She was signing it for all the doctors. They were lined up.
so you've never really said what your grandmother's name was.
Yes, she was Rosie. When she moved to America, she was known as Rachel, but her like Romanian name was Rosie. I have two Rosie nieces already, so that's nice.
And what about her sister? What is her sister's name?
Her sister's name was Leia.
And did she also come to America?
She went to Haifa to Israel. Um, my grandmother couldn't get a visa. It came up that she had like she was sick. I don't know. I don't know the exact details, but she wasn't able, so she went to America.
And but were they in a DP camp at first before
Yes.
they?
Yes. They were in Germany in a DP camp. She got married in the DP camp. And then she was in Rome for quite a few years. She had a baby in Rome. And then she went on a boat to St. Paul, Minnesota, and then moved to Brooklyn. Yeah, where she lives.
DP, for anyone who doesn't know, is displaced persons camps, and they were run by the Allies after the end of World War II, when they had this huge population and didn't know what to do. So
Yeah.
I know a lot of marriages took place because they met people and births and
Yeah. Yeah.
so. And where was her, who she married? Where was your grandfather from?
He actually had a crazy story. He was blonde hair, blue eyes. So he was able to get papers, fake papers,
Wait, where was he
and
born?
um, also in Romania, but I can't remember right now where
Okay, but
in
in
Romania.
Romania.
Yeah, in Romania. Um, he got papers and he escaped. Like he was like living. every few days in another place. And he one time had a roommate who was Jewish and also in hiding. And one day he came home and the landlord was like, the Nazis were here. Didn't you know he's Jewish? They killed him outside. Like, and so he had to get up and leave. And he had it worse after the war because he suffered from a lot of survivor's guilt and
Hmm.
um,
You want to talk
different
about
things.
that just briefly because we have a few more minutes about survivor's guilt? I mean, it wasn't that he wasn't there, he suffered. So
Right.
why do you think he had survivor's guilt?
He was he was probably 19, 20 when it happened, and he saw his parents really being led to Auschwitz. Also, he wasn't in the ghetto already at that point. He had gotten papers. He actually used to sneak into the ghetto every day to put on tefillin until his mother said, "You cannot come back here. Do not, like, I forbid you from coming." Um, so he was one of like eight, I think, or nine. He saw his little sisters starving and saw his little sisters going off and going to Auschwitz. Um, but it's a terrible phenomenon, survivor's guilt, because it doesn't do anything for anyone, but it's, you know,
But it's a very real
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
Did your grandparents know each other before, or
no,
they met in the
no,
camps?
yeah. They met right after the war.
So is there anything else you would like to share with our readers except to say, read my book?
Yeah, read the book. Oh, this is my grandmother.
Oh, great. Thanks for sharing a picture
Yeah.
of Rosie with
And
us.
and then this is us.
Oh, that's a great picture.
Yeah.
That's really
She's
a nice picture.
um she the reason why she wanted to share her story was for Holocaust education, and also because she really believed that people are good. And in today's times, in this world, sometimes I feel hard to believe it. And even when talking to you, which I think you're reviving some of these memories of her and some of these stories of her that inspired me, but I kind of lost a little bit as like we're going through such hard times that um, you look in the mirror and tell yourself, you're so beautiful, you're so beautiful. It doesn't matter what anyone else says, and believe in yourself. And if you go where you want to go, um, and have that grit and survive and that love of life, but also that it's it's gonna pass and it's gonna be okay. And that's how she felt and that's how she lived. And when people asked her, like, what do you do like when you lose hope? I have a video of her saying this. She goes, when I lose hope, I start singing. And I sing for the people and I sing for God and I sing for all the beautiful things that are in this world, even amongst all the bad things. And
One
so,
more question I just thought of. Did she talk about it when you were little, or did you not?
yes,
Okay, so you knew about it from an early age.
which is very interesting because I have a 8-year-old daughter who just yesterday read a graphic novel about the Holocaust for the first time. I hadn't really spoken to her about it. She knows I wrote this book and she knows the words, but she didn't really know. And it was so horrifying for me that she read
Yes.
that book. I was like, I don't know, but I grew up with it always. So,
Interesting.
yeah, I almost couldn't sleep last night because she was starting to ask me questions. And she said, "Oh, do you think it could happen again? I don't want it to happen, you know?" Um, but I think also the difference was the way that I heard her stories were from a very courageous mindset and
Right.
not
I
from
would always say a
yeah,
positive. I know it sounds weird,
yeah,
but a
yeah,
positive. Right. Although luck had a great deal to do with everyone's survival, a lot can
yeah,
be said for their own mental strength, physical strength. I mean, so many factors.
yeah. And I'm actually writing I wrote like a picture book now. It's not published or anything, but I was thinking a lot about it. Like, how did she have the confidence and the courage to survive? And she always spoke about her grandfather who raised her and how much he unconditionally loved her. And he would just pour his love onto her. Love, 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 no matter what. And I think that really gave her the strength to keep going, and it gave her the confidence.
And I can understand how someone who has been so appreciated as a child says, I have to continue. I have
Yeah,
I can't let the Nazis win. I have to
yeah,
continue.
yeah. And it also gives me comfort. Like that's the only thing we can do because her message was always love more, just love each other. Everybody love each other. Stop fighting. Stop, you can have difference of opinion. You can have a different religion. It doesn't matter. But the only thing that matters is that you're kind and you're good and you're respecting other people. So
And
I
we
think
need a lot more of that.
yeah. And
Anyway, I thank you
yeah,
so much for coming on the show.
yeah,
This has really been a very engaging conversation.
yeah.
And even though it's been very engaging, I do have to end as I say at the end of every one of these particular episodes, I say, may the memory of the victims and those who tried to save them be a blessing forever.